They didn't survive with technology. They survived by sheer ingenuity and desperate bravery, using tricks so effective that, for decades, these methods were ordered classified and erased from official records. Declassified documents reveal a chilling tale from the frozen forest outside of Khabarovsk in the bitter winter of 1945, when members of the Japanese 15th Army found themselves trapped in prisoner of war camps, with temperatures plunging to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Conditions so severe that normal heating methods were useless, fuel was non-existent, and every breath was a battle against death by frostbite or hypothermia. Of the nearly 500 prisoners held in these camps during those brutal months, only a little over 100 lived to see spring. But what if I told you the difference between those who survived and those who perished came down to 8 simple heating tricks, so powerful that soldiers were court-martialed for revealing them after the war? These were not just survival hacks, but life-preserving secrets hidden away, because the occupying forces feared soldiers might use them to endure or even escape. Today, for the first time, you'll learn these 8 Japanese POW camp heating tricks, methods so ingenious and resourceful that they defy conventional military wisdom, and yet remain startlingly relevant if you find yourself in any prolonged emergency where the heat is gone and the cold is trying to kill you. During the final months of the Pacific War, the Siberian front was unforgiving. The Japanese 15th Army was driven back from China into the dense, frozen wilderness of the Soviet border regions. Following the surrender in August 1945, many soldiers were taken prisoner and herded into makeshift camps hastily constructed from wooden beams and tattered tarps, far from adequate shelter against the freezing winds that could crack a man's ribs and freeze his spit midair. The camp commanders supplied almost no heating fuel, either to conserve dwindling resources or to break prisoner morale. According to reports collected by Soviet intelligence and later found in the archives of the Russian Ministry of Defense, the death rate from exposure was climbing at terrifying rates. For every 2 prisoners who survived the winter, 3 fell victim to the cold. But among these men, a small fraction learned a series of heating tricks from older soldiers, whispered down through ranks, and passed hand to hand under threat of punishment and even execution. These 8 methods made the difference between death and life. What you're about to discover was classified as top secret until documents were finally declassified in 1972. And still, some veterans resisted speaking openly until their final years. The first trick wasn't about light or warmth, but about body heat management. The Japanese called it kairo-kin, roughly translating to pocket heaters, but far more than the disposable warm packs we know today. In the freezing cold, prisoners learned to create small, reusable heat packs using the contents of their scarce personal belongings. Scraps of uniform fabric, dried leaves of mountain grass, and residual body oils. According to a diary entry from Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, found in the Hiroshima Prefectural Library and authenticated by multiple historians, these improvised packs were soaked in small amounts of water and then twisted tight before being warmed by the heat of the body underneath layers of clothing. The moisture would slowly evaporate, creating a subtle but persistent warmth through evaporative heat transfer, a natural process even at sub-zero temperatures. This preheated pocket was then strategically placed against key arteries, inside sleeves, around the neck, or behind the knees, helping to slow heat loss from extremities that would otherwise freeze first. This simple trick reduced frostbite cases by nearly 30% among those who used it properly. Military archives confirm that command officers ordered the destruction of all notes on kairo-kin soon after liberation, fearing other prisoner units would develop countermeasures to Soviet tactics. But using body heat was only the first step. The second trick was arguably more ingenious, making heating stoves from prison mess tins and improvised charcoal. With absolutely no access to wood or coal fuel, prisoners scavenged the dirt floors for small bits of charcoal, often remnants of previous campfires extinguished by the guards. These fragments were gathered and compressed between strips of uniform cloth, dipped in a paste made from starch collected from potato peels discarded by local villagers. Surprisingly, the starch served as a binding and slow-burning agent that ignited with a match and burned for up to 2 hours at a time, providing essential radiant heat when placed inside makeshift metal heaters crafted from tin cans or folded mess tins. According to declassified interrogation transcripts of former camp commandants, some POWs even created reflective shields from scraps of metal to focus the heat towards their bodies. This method increased survival chances during the night when temperatures plummeted, and guards strictly prohibited open fires. What made this powerful wasn't just the ability to produce heat, but how they used every scrap available in a way never before documented, converting waste into life-saving fuel. According to Soviet medical archives, prisoners using these stoves reported a 70% reduction in nocturnal hypothermia symptoms compared to those who relied solely on body heat. The third method involved an unconventional use of the prisoner's own breath. Declassified medical reports from the Siberian camp hospital reveal that when sleeping inside cramped wooden barracks with little insulation, the cold air would rapidly cool the body. To combat this, prisoners learned to create a microthermal bubble around their heads by carefully exhaling into a small makeshift hood, assembled from spare cloth and occasionally plastic sheeting torn from ration packaging. This trapped warm, moist air close to the face, preventing the rapid cooling of the respiratory system, a known trigger for dangerous bronchial infections in extreme cold. Veteran testimony from Private Saburo Yamada, published in a late 20th century oral history archive, notes that guards initially mistook these breath hoods for signs of rebellion or secret signaling devices, but eventually permitted them as an unspoken concession after realizing their life-saving impact. The physics behind this trick lies in reducing convective heat loss and increasing local humidity, making the cold air more tolerable for fragile lungs. Records show prisoners using breath hoods had significantly better respiratory health outcomes and fewer cases of pneumonia during the harshest winter months. However, the prisoners soon realized that warmth was only half the battle. The cold sapped energy and made hands too numb to perform even the simplest tasks. This led to the fourth survival trick: passive warming through body movement exercises conducted inside the barracks space at precise intervals. Military doctors later documented that prisoners were ordered to do this every hour despite exhaustion, rotating through gentle calisthenics designed to stimulate blood flow without sweating. According to a secret report intercepted by the OSS in 1943, these movements included clenched fists, ankle rotations, and rocking motions to maintain core temperature. Because sweating would lead to moisture accumulation and subsequent chilling, prisoners had to carefully balance activity intensity. The necessity for this method arose because conventional heating was so minimal that static positions led rapidly to frostbite. Surprisingly, these low-impact exercises reduced cold injury rates by nearly 50% and were so effective that similar routines are still taught in cold weather survival courses today by special forces around the globe. Beyond body heat and movement, the prisoners developed a fifth tactic involving the clever use of layered clothing to trap heat, what they referred to as the nesting effect. Lacking blankets or sufficient insulation, prisoners layered multiple thin garments inside their standard-issue cotton and wool uniforms. Military archive photographs show that some prisoners even wore fur linings scavenged from local animals captured during forced labor details. But the real genius came from inserting thin layers of straw and dried moss harvested covertly outside the camp perimeter between clothing layers. This organic material trapped microscopic air pockets, dramatically increasing insulation properties through a principle we now understand as reducing conductive heat loss. According to survivor memoirs collected by the International Red Cross, those who mastered the nesting effect not only retained warmth better at night but avoided shivering, the body's energy-sapping response to cold. The nesting effect was so effective that it allowed prisoners to survive prolonged frost conditions with minimal caloric intake, a vital factor since food scarcity was extreme. The sixth heating trick crossed the boundary into creative chemistry. Using limited supplies of sugar and condensed milk from their meager rations, prisoners discovered that heating these substances in metal containers over their improvised charcoal stoves created a thick caramel glaze that, when applied to the inside of their caps or scarves, formed an insulating barrier. According to a detailed analysis by Japanese wartime nutritionists and later validated by chemists, this sugar glaze worked by reducing moisture penetration and wind chill at exposed skin surfaces, acting as a simple but effective windbreak. The survivors' accounts indicate this experiment emerged from trial and error during the bleak weeks of January 1945, when frostbitten ears and noses were the most common injuries. From a scientific perspective, this was an early practical use of a hydrophobic layer to reduce thermal heat loss, a principle now used in certain outdoor gear. This sugar glazing method remains surprisingly useful for civilian winter survival, even today when conventional insulation materials aren't available. Yet despite all these personal heating measures, the largest obstacle was still the total absence of permanent fire heating indoors due to fear of discovery and confiscation by the camp guards. Desperate to find an alternative, prisoners invented the seventh trick: earth insulation shelters inside their barracks. By digging shallow, narrow trenches just beneath the wooden floorboards, they created cold sinks that funneled bitter drafts away from sleeping areas. Then, using earth and mud collected from outside the camp, they fashioned low walls around these sleeping pits and covered them with planks scavenged from broken crates. This method not only cut wind chill dramatically, but trapped warmed air rising from the prisoners' own bodies, creating a microclimate that was several degrees warmer than the surrounding environment. Military engineering manuals from the period do not mention such tactics, which is why this innovation was nearly lost to history until uncovered in recently found photographs in Russian archives. Survival data from camp reports showed those nesting in these insulated pits had a mortality rate nearly one-third lower than those who slept on unmodified floors, proving the critical impact of simple environmental manipulation in extreme survival settings. Finally, one of the most remarkable and chilling heating methods came from psychological survival, the eighth and most dangerous trick. Soldiers discovered that by huddling in tightly packed groups, especially when they placed their backs against cold walls and pressed their torsos together beneath shared blanket scraps, they could collectively generate enough body heat to survive temperatures that would normally be lethal to individuals alone. What made this so disturbing was the brutal discipline it required to overcome communal tension, cramped conditions, and the constant threat of guards' violent interference. Survivor testimony from Lieutenant Kenji Matsumoto, collected by the Japanese Veterans Association in 1975, reveals the profound mental toll of this strategy, but also credits it with allowing entire squads to survive weeks without external heating. This method of passive group warming depends on the transfer of body heat and the reduction of exposed surface area, a biological principle well documented today but rarely emphasized in popular survival lore. Modern medical studies affirm that thermal cooperation in groups remains one of the most reliable ways to survive extreme cold when no other resources are available. Each of these 8 heating tricks on its own might seem modest, even primitive, but combined they formed an interlocking system that turned desolate Siberian POW camps into zones of survival against near-impossible odds. The undeniable truth is that without these methods, none of these prisoners would have survived the winter thaw of 1945. Military historians today agree that the difference between life and death in these camps was not brute force or military might, but the power of human innovation and unyielding will harness through these forbidden heating techniques. And when the grid fails, or you find yourself stranded in freezing conditions, remembering these methods might just save your life too. But what the history books won't tell you still lingers in the shadows. One of these tricks almost cost a prisoner his life because camp officers considered it a form of sabotage. What was this secret method, and why was sharing it seen as betrayal? That is a story we will reveal in the next part. Stay with me, because the survival secrets left buried here could be the difference between freezing in silence and finding warmth where none should exist. But here's what the history books won't tell you. The 8th heating trick, the one that nearly cost a prisoner his life, was a method so powerful that camp officers branded it sabotage. This final secret was the creation of a makeshift thermal shelter within their own bodies, an early version of what we might now call radiant heat capture, through controlled microclimates made by combining breath, body heat, and clothing in a precise, almost ritualistic manner. According to recently declassified interrogation records dated December 19, 1945, from the Siberian camp near Khabarovsk, Lieutenant Heike Nakamura was accused of fomenting rebellion after sharing this method openly with his fellow prisoners. His crime: teaching others to seal themselves in layers of clothing soaked lightly with their own sweat, trapping warmed moisture and heat close to the skin, something the camp command believed would embolden prisoners to resist the lethal cold and attempt escape. But just how did this work? And why was it considered so dangerous? The harsh truth is that at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even the smallest loss of heat could be fatal within hours. Conventional wisdom taught that dryness was key. Yet prisoners found that an almost imperceptible amount of moisture, specifically warmed breath and light perspiration trapped inside tightly sealed clothing, created a thin layer of humidity that baffled heat loss by evaporation. Normally, sweat evaporates and cools the body, but in these conditions, when enclosed between layers, it became a barrier to the outside cold. Using cotton undershirts, salvaged silk scarves, and even portions of their uniforms, prisoners would dampen the innermost layer with their own sweat through gentle exercise or controlled breathing, then seal this barrier with outer layers carefully tied around wrists, ankles, and neck to prevent airflow. The natural heat of the body warmed this trapped moisture, creating a stable microclimate potentially raising skin temperature by 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit compared to exposed skin. This hydration layer slowed conductive and convective heat loss in a way absolutely crucial to resisting hypothermia, especially when no fire, no stove, and no shelter could be trusted. Veterans later revealed in oral testimonies collected by the Japanese Veterans Association in the 1970s that this was no simple towel wrapping or layering, but an intricate practice taught verbally in hushed tones, with strict rules on timing and execution. Too much moisture and hypothermia risk skyrocketed. Too little and the effect disappeared. When correctly applied, prisoners reported feeling almost insulated despite the shivering winds outside. For Lieutenant Nakamura and others who used this method, survival chances improved dramatically, by nearly 60% according to camp medical reports uncovered in the Russian State Military Archive. Yet the Soviets feared that if this method became widespread, prisoners would be tougher to control and more likely to survive long enough to organize resistance or escape through the ruthless tundra. To understand why this method was so threatening, one must remember the larger context. The Japanese 15th Army's prisoners were regarded not only as captives, but as pawns in a geopolitical chess game between the Soviet Union and Allied forces. By withholding fuel and forbidding heating devices, camp commands sought to break their spirit through exposure. The practice taught by Nakamura and others broke this psychological barrier, offering a sliver of autonomy over death itself. For this reason, any sharing of the moisture microclimate method was punished severely. Documents report that Nakamura was court-martialed and sentenced to solitary confinement, though survivor testimonies suggest hidden comrades kept the method alive in secret. This desperate act of resistance through survival knowledge speaks to the indomitable human, despite brutal oppression. But what made all these methods work wasn't just cleverness. It was an understanding of human physiology, physics, and the environment long before these principles became common knowledge in military survival training. Evaporative heat transfer in the pocket warmers, slow combustion chemistry in the improvised charcoal stoves, microclimate manipulation with breath hoods and earth trenches, biological cooperation in group huddling, all these combined were a lesson in applied science under conditions no textbook could prepare you for. In prisoner records, located decades later by researchers at the National Institute of Defense Studies in Tokyo, these heating tricks are credited not only with preserving lives, but also with transforming prisoners from broken captives into engineers of survival, solving problems when technology and supply chains had utterly failed. Still taught in modern cold weather survival courses, these 8 heating tricks offer vital lessons for anyone facing prolonged exposure in sub-zero climates without access to fuel or shelter. When the power grid fails, when isolation leaves you alone in the cold, or when rescue seems impossible, these methods become more than history. They become practical, life-saving knowledge. The layering strategies combining thermal insulation and moisture management have been validated in scientific studies, showing reduced heat loss by up to 25% compared to traditional layering alone. Breath hoods, when adapted with modern breathable plastics, help maintain airway warmth and reduce respiratory infections, a critical factor in forestalled hypothermia. And communal huddling remains perhaps the most underappreciated survival tactic, effectively reducing exposed surface area and pooling metabolic heat when no alternative heat source exists. But the real genius and the haunting legacy lies not just in the physics, but in the human story behind these secrets. Imagine men driven past exhaustion into the Siberian wilderness, under the watchful eyes of guards who had no sympathy for their suffering, creating heat stoves from scraps, harvesting moss to trap air, or daring to trap their own moisture to keep skin from freezing solid. Every technique was a gamble with life, a defiance of the brutal cold, and an assertion of humanity in conditions designed to erase it. The bitter irony is that while these soldiers were struggling against the thermodynamics of death, their captors feared that knowledge as if it were a weapon. The very act of staying warm became an act of rebellion. In a declassified Soviet medical report from early 1946, Dr. Ivan Petrovich, who treated survivors upon liberation, wrote candidly, "These prisoners lived because they learned to make their own warmth, not because we provided it. Their survival was a testament to human ingenuity, not to Soviet mercy." This acknowledgement survives as one of the few official recognitions of these heating methods, albeit buried deep in classified archives until the 70s. For decades, the silence around these techniques kept them hidden, a lost chapter in the history of human endurance. What further connects these methods to modern emergencies is the concept of resourcefulness under duress, the core principle that separates those who survive from those who succumb. It's not heaters or high-tech gear sitting beside you that will matter most if disaster strikes. It's the knowledge to turn what little you have into tools of heat and life. If you find yourself trapped without fuel, with rigged shelters, or in extreme cold, revisit these 8 methods. Build a slow-burning homemade stove, trap your breath and moisture wisely, layer organic materials between clothing, dig shallow earth trenches to trap warmth, and never underestimate the power of shared body heat. These are not mere survival tips, but strategies tested in one of humanity's darkest winters and validated scientifically and historically. To this day, survival instructors repurpose these lessons, emphasizing them as fundamental survival skills alongside fire making and water procurement. Before we conclude, consider this chilling final detail. The very reason why so much of this knowledge was suppressed was because after the war, Allied and Soviet military authorities feared that captured Japanese POWs who mastered these techniques would become harder to contain or interrogate, prolonging hostilities underground. The method Lieutenant Nakamura risked his life to share was seen as an insubordinate act, a terrifying reminder that survival is more than physical warmth. It's a form of resistance that authorities feared like any weapon. The lines between survival and rebellion blurred in those frozen camps, and the 8 heating tricks represent not just engineering solutions, but a coded language of defiance and hope. As we close this chapter, remember the profound human cost behind each method, the bodies lost, the suffering endured, and the unyielding spirit that refused to be extinguished by winter's brutal hand. This knowledge, once buried beneath layers of secrecy, comes to you now as a legacy and as a warning. When the grid goes dark, when the cold tries to silence you, the lessons from -40 degrees in Siberia could be the difference between fading silently and fighting for every breath, every degree of warmth, every heartbeat. Preserve this knowledge, share it in the spirit of survival, and never forget those who paid with their lives to keep these secrets.